What is going on? This is Michael Hacker with the Hacker Outdoors podcast. Today's episode, Michael tries to talk Joey into bird watching. Brian shares his winter trout fishing tips. And then Michael goes on a rant about people not handling fish correctly. If you like what you hear, please give us a thumbs up and a review. And without further ado, and we are 10 minutes in here. Hey guys, how's it going?
Going good.
Living the dream.
Living the dream. I like it. So we're a day late. We're going to be releasing this today. This is Saturday, January 16th. You know, a lot of things kind of going on in the world. I figured today, I created somewhat of a calendar of things that we're going to talk about. Look at that little puppy, man. Oh, how cute. A little bit of a calendar of things that we're going to talk about coming up, but there were a few things that kind of hit my radar this week that I wanted to bring up and wanted to talk to you guys about it and see your kind of feedback on that. First and foremost, Joe, I know you've been trying to get outside. I did happen across this, I don't know where Great Falls, Maryland is and how far it is from you, but a rare, brilliantly colored bird was spotted at a Maryland park and it's drawing massive crowds. It's it's a colored male painted bunting. And it is a beautiful bird. I will link to it in the show notes if those of you who are not birders want to see it. It looks like a Skittle. All the colors of the Skittles mixed together. So
Great Falls is either in Western Maryland or Northern Maryland by me. I forget. Great Falls might be near me.
I'll look it up, actually.
Unfortunately, I don't have my computer in front of me right this second due to unusual circumstances.
It's always unusual. Life's unusual, isn't it? It looks like Great Falls is actually not too far from Potomac.
Okay.
So not far from you, Bethesda, Silver Spring,
That's
like
really,
Rockville, west and south.
It's very urban area.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Down by where I fish, kind of near the Potomac.
Yeah,
probably near by the Virginia border.
That's exactly where it is.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, so I figured, hey, Joe, while you're kind of stuck inside preparing for your February fishing tournaments, why don't you get outside and go see some birds, man?
Yeah, I gotta look into that. I mean, to me, great. That's like smack in the urban area. Kind of crazy. They're seeing that bird there, Yeah,
it's apparently pretty rare. Brian and I were talking this week, and we were talking about the kind of the minimalist fishing idea, right? Kind of if sometimes when we go fishing, we bring entirely way too many things. Joe, and you and I were talking about how, maybe you should do something and some sort of video where you can kind of show your bags and how you organize everything. But that got me thinking, if I could only fish with one lure or fly every time I went out, regardless of the species of fish I was targeting, it would absolutely be a black woolly booger. Like 100% that would be my go-to. Now, I see Brian's nodding his head there. Brian, would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, the movement on a black woolly bugger has, for me at least, has caught smallmouth, largemouth, sunnies, panfish, every trout species so far, and that I've seen so far at least. And I could see it working everywhere. And I'm actually curious how it would work in the ocean. We should try it this upcoming spring and for stripers.
You read my mind on that one. I think it would work for that, quite honestly. And I've caught pike on it. I've caught carp on it. All the fish you've named. There is not a single species so far that I haven't been able to catch on that fly. So it would be cool just to head out. I know, like the whole Tenkara movement, right? You're out there with a rod with no reel, of course, and the real Tenkara enthusiasts go out there with just a single spool of line and one or two flies, and that's literally it. Now, Tenkara flies are a little bit different than we'll call them Western flies, but I would definitely go with a black woolly booger. I think regardless, that's the go-to. Now, Joe, in your world, what would you use?
Mine would probably have to be a drop shot of the weedless variety. It just catches fish anywhere throughout the country with the roboworm. green pumpkin color probably.
That's what I was
That
going to
catches
ask.
them anywhere in the country, anytime, any place, any time of the year, any condition pretty much. I've caught them on, and it will catch all the species in the lake. From bluegill on up to walleye and muskie will catch. It's just a flat out fish catcher, and I like fishing it because you're fishing on light tackle and just makes it even more fun. But it would definitely have to be the drop shot.
Yeah, you've converted me on the drop shot, man. I think that's been when I do use my spinning rod. That's I use that ultra light, ugly stick, and just it's so much fun. Of course, conditions considering, those really weedy lakes like you and I fished a couple times, Joe. It's just not always a good time, but it's definitely a go-to, and I'd have to agree with that with my spinning.
Well, once you get it tuned up, there's different weights for there's different style drop shot weights for, whether it be grassy or rock. And once you get the grass setup dialed in, you can fish really heavy cover with it, surprisingly. Some people call it power shotting. And it just, so what a lot of pros throw, and it just puts fish in the boat. It puts them in quick. And like I said, I've caught catfish, snakehead, largemouth, smallmouth, perch, crappie. I mean, down the list, I've caught it on that thing. And, like I said, roboworm, green pumpkin variety, and I think you'd be good anywhere.
Yeah, Brian and I know all about the green pumpkin. That's the go-to. That is absolutely the go-to, man. Yes. So, I frequent a lot of fishing forums, right? And I belong to a bunch of groups on Facebook and follow a bunch of people on Instagram, of course. We just created a Gab account, in lieu of Twitter. And my nephews were saying we should probably get on TikTok. But as far as groups go, I'm constantly seeing on these fishing forums pics of guys lipping fish, right? Like traditionally, you think of catching bass and you lip the bass, right? You see how big their mouth is, and it's just kind of the traditional photo that you're taking. But in this particular photo, and in a lot of photo in the past couple of weeks, these guys are lipping trout, and the comments on social media in general, they always tend to be hysterical. The responses to people, everyone calling who and what a Karen, right? But lipping, I don't necessarily agree with all the time, and I definitely don't agree with lipping trout fish and trout in general. I should say, not trout fish, because one of the main takeaways I get from this is people don't really know what it means to catch and release fish, right? And these guys aren't keeping them 9 times out of 10. If you're catching the fish, I get it, right? Like it's your fish, you can do what you want to it. If you're harvesting it, I'd still say you'd want to take care of it as best as possible before you dispatch the poor creature. But if you're catching fish and you're intending to release it, you want to make sure that they survive, right? And I saw this staggering figure. It was 9% of all caught and released stripers or rockfish die. And that's just for stripers. And just imagine how many stripers are caught every given season. And if that's the numbers for something that's so researched on a fish so researched, imagine what it could be like on other species such as trout.
So and I've heard studies like that, and I can tell you for fishing tournaments, I mean, we don't have big die-offs like that. And I wonder if the striped bass, what plays into it is the amount of people keeping, keeper size. Because I mean, when I would striper fish, if they weren't keeper size, they were out of the water with us for maybe 2-3 minutes and back in. Not even that, probably less than that. I've never seen big die-off. And the other thing is too, I mean, the bay this year, I mean, it's been hit. I mean, tons of boats out there rock fishing, and they say the population is just exploding down here. So I don't know. Sometimes I think some of those studies are a little wonky, just from what I've seen. But
well, that from the NOAA, and a lot of the New Jersey in general, so as of January 1st, New Jersey, and it's actually up and down the eastern seaboard because it's a migratory fish. We've changed the rules to say that it has to be an inline circle hook if you're using live bait. Now, we're not live bait fishermen, typically speaking, but there's some interesting studies that are out there, and of course the NOAA, is doing a significant amount of research specifically around stripers and sharks and other migratory animals in the sea, of course. But there's something to be said. Florida Fish and Wildlife, for example, said wounds may appear minor to anglers, but damage to gills, eyes, or internal organs can be fatal. If the fish is hooked deep in the throat or gut, research shows that it is best to cut the leader off at the hook and leave the hook inside the fish. Prolonged attempts to remove the hook often do more harm than good. They're also saying that in a study of mortality rate in snook, 24 snook were deep hooked. When we removed the hooks from the 12 snook and we left the hooks intact and cut the leader in the other 12 snook, we found that the 4 of the 12 deep hook snook died after the hooks were removed. None died when we simply cut the leader and left the hook alone. So I think that has something to seriously do with it. And I'm a big proponent of using barbless hooks, generally speaking, just to get them out of my hands. And now, if I'm keeping the fish, I'm not as worried. But just think, if you don't catch a keeper size, what does that mean, right? Brian, you and I have done a lot of fishing together over the years, and I think when we first started, we made the rookie mistakes, right? And I think that's what it is. That it comes down to, is just not knowing exactly why it is. And a lot of the guys on the forums are really coming down on this, circle hook thing, saying that it's really imposing a problem for them and to them for fishing. And I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment. I think that anything that you can do, a circle hook is great for catching fish, in my opinion, because it goes exactly where you want it on the fish, right? And it creates an easier way to remove the hook. And then if you're even pinching those barbs down, or you're, doing a barbless hook, it makes your life even easier releasing that, especially as a catch and release fisherman. But I thought those stats were a little, staggering, and taken away the ability to deep gut hook fish. Now, Joe, tournament fishing, I think you guys do things a little bit differently. And I think, the majority of bass that I've ever caught, I've never really had the issue of gut hooking fish. I think maybe one out of hundreds of fish that I've hooked have ever been gut hooked. But I think that the tip of actually just cutting the leader and leaving it in there, let it rot out, is always a good feedback.
Yeah, that's what they say to do. And I've caught fish that still have hooks in them, and they do rust out eventually. But there's also, with bass, if they do get hooked down there past the pinchers, there's a way to safely unhook them too. You go in through the through the gills, and you take your pliers to the gills, not touching the gill plates though. And if you just grab the hook and just roll it slightly, it comes right out without any real damage. And that helps a lot too. But if you ever get a case where there's one hooked really deep, which doesn't happen very often, it's best to cut it and leave it. But the biggest thing that will happen in bass fishing sometimes, doesn't happen a lot, it seems like if a fish gets hooked in the tongue, that's pretty much like a death sentence if you don't get it back out in the water pretty quickly.
I have never seen that.
Mm-hmm. If you hook one in the tongue and you put it in that live well, it's quite often you'll come back with a dead fish.
Wow.
It doesn't happen often, but it does. Like, if you watch some of the pro fishing YouTubes, you'll hear them during the tournament say, "Oh man, that one's tongue hooked. I just gotta let it go." I don't know why it does that, or what's the reasoning, but that's the one thing. But like I said, a lot of times if it's past the crushers down there, when you look out in bass's mouth at the crushers, you go through the gill with the pair of pliers, and you just roll it, and it comes out really easy, and doesn't really hurt the fish at all. And they've always been fine. I've had to do that a couple times and no issues. But see, like I know, like FLW tracks the rate of survival of their fish throughout the year. I think last year was like 99.998% of fish that were caught survived.
Hmm.
Live well treatments and how good live wells are nowadays. And, for bass, it doesn't seem to really be doing a lot of damage to the population.
Well, they're a bit hardier, and I know, Brian, you were telling me a story earlier, right, about going with people that were lipping trout, and I think trout are really more sensitive fish than a bass, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is your go-to when you're catching trout? Like, how do you handle them safely? I know there's the right way to do it, and according to science at least, but what is your go-to way to even handle them? Do you net them?
Yeah. So, in the best case scenario, uh, you wouldn't even have to handle them. Most of the time, like the best trout fishermen you'll see, they'll catch fish. It'll be barbless hook. They'll bring them in. They'll wet their hands, and before they won't even take it out of the water. In the water, they'll just cup them with their hand and somehow get the hook out of their mouth, and on the fish will be going. But the safest way for, let's say, the normal weekend warrior fisherman that's gonna go out to whatever trout streams local to them, they say that rubber net, and wetting hands, and least amount of time out of the water possible. There's a few other things, like temperature of the air, temperature of the water, those play a big part in it as well. So if it's over a certain temperature, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but if the water's over a certain temperature and the air's over a certain temperature, you shouldn't be trout fishing. And let's face it, at that point anyway, we'd be going after bass or ocean fishing for flounder anyway. So it's not that big of a deal. But that's kind of the basis. So wet your hands before you touch fish, and keep the fish out of the water as little time as possible. And more times than not, if it's the air's cool and the water's cool, the fish is going to survive.
Yeah, I've never flipping trout. I've always seen people when they catch trout hold them like both hands in the water, kind of lipping the trout. Kind of,
it's
strange.
Silly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, Joe. And Brian, I know that there's a whole water temperature list on when you should do it, right? So it's like 77 is the upper limit of a trout survival. That's 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at which anglers should not consider trout fishing is 68 degrees. So when the water temperature hits 68, that's pretty much stop fishing all in all. It lipping trout, I will never understand. I mean, there's really, look at those wild men go. But that's really, when I say 68, I'm saying browns and rainbows. I think brook trout tend to be a little bit more temperature sensitive. Some people, from what I'm reading, it's 65. They become a little bit more stressed. In the summertime here in the Northeast, though, like, target other species. Like, it's not worth doing it. I met a guy down at the South Branch of the Raritan River, and he was telling me he fishes there year round. And I had asked him, I said, well, why? And he's like, well, it's in a gorge enough, right, that the temperatures seem cool enough. And I said, well, I don't necessarily feel good about that. I know in our early days of trout fishing, we would go out and we would fish year round for them. But, with the advent of this information online now, right, and these resources that didn't exist when we first started trout fishing, we now know, like, that is not a good idea to do that. And it's kind of maddening. The other thing that I see that really kind of drives me nuts is people taking photos with fish, right? Like, and we talked about this a little bit a couple episodes ago, right? Where it's like you're struggling to do all these things and actually get this photo of the fish that you caught. So that's why a lot of times when we go fishing, I don't even get video of it. I don't even get pictures of it. It's just simply like, I'm trying to get that creature, that animal, that life form back into the water as quickly as possible with as little harm to it as possible. And I mean, it's always best if you're traveling with someone or fishing with someone. I actually came upon keepfishwet.org. So it's a group of marine biologists that are avid fishermen that got together to create this, kind of fishing tutorial. They have research articles on their website. I'll link to it in the show notes, where they talk about, the principles of how to make these fish survive better, right? So principle one is minimize air exposure. So when you're lifting a fish out of the water to take a photo with it, if you're going to do that, which don't necessarily recommend, limit the time that you're lifting them out of the water and make sure they're over the water in case they flop out, right? Flop out of your hands and land on the ground. Now, they're living in an, ecosystem or, in an environment where they're weightless. You're bringing them out of the water and now all of a sudden you're inflicting forces to their bodies that they're not used to. So gravity, as you're holding them in your hand like this, even if you think you're being as gentle as possible, where your hand's being placed, their body weight is pushing down onto your hands and it could cause organ damage. Once again, we're talking strictly, if you're doing catch and release.
Is that
So
for trout? Because
that's for trout, yeah.
yeah, because
Very
for bass, the opposite. They say, especially with bigger bass, you don't want to just lip it. They want you to hold the lip and hold your hand under the belly.
Well, they're not saying don't hold them, right? They're saying you can hold them. Just be mindful of where your hands are. Like I think right under their fins, their dorsal fins, like that whole little section right there. If you put your hand there, you see pictures of guys holding fish and they're like fatty, like these trout, fat falling over their hands. That means that their internal organs are now touching your hands for all intents and purposes.
Right.
So just be mindful of that. And obviously you want to minimize the air exposure, right? Like keep them wet, keep them in the water, eliminate contact with dry surfaces because quite honestly, they have this layer of slime on them. It's slime to us, but it's protective mucus and scales that protect them from disease. So when you have contact with them, if they're rubbing up against your shirt or rubbing up against your dry hand, or I see guys fishing with, gloves on and they're handling the fish with the gloves on, take them off because what it does is it can remove the slime and the scales. And that just makes them more susceptible to all sorts of problems, diseases, fungal infections. And then of course, rubbing up against you out of the water can cause some sort of, internal organ issues as well. And just reduce handling time, right? Like get them back in that water as quickly as freaking possible if you're releasing them. And that's it. I mean, you're trying not to handle them and make them stressed as much as possible. And of course, it's when you're fishing for them and you're reeling them in, the goal is to get them to you as quickly as possible. I like to play them out a little bit here and there. Trout, I typically don't do that with. But Joe, you were yelling at me about catching bass this summer and how quickly I get them to the boat, and then I'm just trying to yank them back onto the boat. But like it really is, you want to get them out of the water or out of the hook as much as possible and as quickly as possible so that they get beyond their merry little way. We'll link to this in the show notes. I just thought it was kind of important to talk about.
I'm not familiar with trout. They must be a more sensitive breed of fish, because bass, I mean, there's stuff we put in the live wells that help the bass slime coat and all that, and it keeps them well, but trout seem much more fickle to me than bass. But the same way with the big bass, if somebody catches a big bass and it's not a tournament, they'll between taking pictures and stuff, they'll put them in the water and get them going again and take them back out for a picture. It's never really good to have them out for minutes upon minutes, no. But for the most part, the guys I all fish with and women, they treat the bass great. And I've never really personally witnessed fish dying at these tournaments. I know there was one up in Canada in 2019 where 200 smallmouth died, but that was because of the handling by the tournament director and the way they were weighing the fish and what they were doing after weighing the fish. Like in our tournaments, we have a special boat. So after you weigh the fish, they're in water and oxygen in water the whole time. After you weigh the fish, you put them in the release boat, which is this big special boat, and it's got live wells in there with aerated water and this, that, and they release them immediately. Well, the guy in Canada, what he did, he was supposed to have a release boat, but he didn't. So he had like 2 fish tanks up there, and he filled it with water and put all the bass in there. Well, that many bass in there killed all oxygen and killed the fish. The guy received a pretty big fine and a lifetime ban on fishing in that province. That was disturbing to see and hear. It was a big name guy who was involved in the tournament and was the cause of it. And when I read that story recently, I couldn't believe the handling procedures he allowed to happen. there at the tournament. I mean, basically, like I said, it sounds like he bought like a fish tank and just filled it up with water and just had all the guys put their fish in there. And at the end of the day, he was, going to release them from the fish tank, but that's not how it works. They have to have enough oxygen and all that in the water, and it just killed 200 smallmouth. So
it's a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah. So seasonal fishing is, a whole other thing. I think it goes across all types of fish that we fish for, from people fishing for, winter striped bass and, blackfish to, us fishing for salmonoid type fish, let's say, specifically rainbow trout and brown trout up here in the Northeast. The fishing slows down, so does the fish. And depending on the air temperature, you want to spend less time with fish in your hands as well. So on the flip side, as I mentioned earlier, the spending time with fish out of the water, you want to get them back in the water as quickly as possible. In the winter, it's you think because it's cooler, you can spend a little more time, but you can't because fish can freeze. It's wet, and you always see like in movies like I think Grumpy Old Man off the top of my head where they get in the fight on the ice while they're ice fishing and they almost stab them with the frozen fish. And, that's a real thing. Fish freeze when they're in the air. So that's just something else I wanted to mention as well. Ocean. Go ahead.
Funny story. Snakehead do not freeze. You can put them on ice and take them home, and like 8 hours later, they'll still be alive.
Snapping away.
Yeah. There's a video of a guy who caught one in the bay just recently, not too long ago, and he put it on ice to take it home to eat. And it was literally probably like 8 hours later, he took it out of the ice and was in his kitchen. The fish was still alive. Pretty crazy.
Wow. No, I didn't know that, Brian. I think that's a good point, right? I think that kind of goes back to keeping them in the water as quickly as possible. I've been watching a lot of ice fishing videos, right? I'm hoping that it drops down a little bit again, so maybe that the lakes freeze over here in Jersey so that I can give it a whirl. But watching them pull these fish out of the hole, and then like the ones that they're keeping, they flop down onto the ice. That thing is rock solid within a minute. Like they'll be flopping around for minutes in the summertime, if not longer sometimes. But in the wintertime, they definitely, I don't know, it's air, right? Cold, it's science. That's the way it works.
Right, Brian, with bass in the winter, they're very lethargic and they'll lay down in the mud and won't move as much because of the cold temperatures. But yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Brian, what is your go-to for trout in the wintertime, right? So I've been kind of trialing a few things and I've been meaning to talk to you about this, but do you have a go-to pattern that you like fishing with when you're fly fishing?
Yeah. So with trout, the common thought is the colder it is, the smaller you go. So I typically use like a zebra midge. I'm giving trade secrets away here, but I'll do like usually like a weighted bead ahead of it, maybe a pheasant tail or a woolly bugger like we were talking about earlier, and then off that I'll tie a midge, and basically that midge will just slow drift. You work super slow like you would in any other fishing in the winter. But that's been my go-to. Funny enough, I would say most fish you catch when it's super cold will be on the woolly bugger still, at least for me. But I think the midge pattern has a lot to do with the fish actually going in for the strike. I think just going for the bigger meal, which is at that point it's the woolly bugger that looks like a leech. But yeah, that's pretty much my go-to. Lighter tackle, fish slower. I use longer tapered leader. I'll tie an extra 5 feet onto it, whatever the smallest tippet I have, and just fish slow.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Slow and that teaser, right, where you're doing a dropper. When you're going with a small nymph in general, try and go as small as 6X or 7X. That's, typically the best way to do it because, winter streams typically, this year's been super weird. They're very low and very clear because the ice melt or the snow melt hasn't happened yet. But, nymph fishing is awesome, the name of the game this time of year. But I just did that woolly bugger, man. It just my go-to. And I went fishing during the snowstorm here a couple weeks ago, right? Was it 2 Sundays ago now?
Mm-hmm.
And I was out there and I was doing, this dropper, and I had woolly bugger down to a zebra, and I was just getting so frustrated. Number one, it's no matter how many times you spray your guides, it's still freezing up, right? No matter how many times your hands are getting cold, you're getting frustrated. You just, yeah, I I don't know. I agree with you, but I think that's all very good tips. Um, so I think we're coming up to a half hour here, guys, and always a pleasure talking to you. We'll try and get another one recorded on Tuesday. The topic of conversation is going to be hiking.
Nice.
So we'll give you some ideas for what it is we bring with us when we go hiking, what we look for when we go hiking, and how I think all of us, Brian and I especially, try to avoid the public at large when we do that and go off the beaten path.
Always.
Joe, you used to enjoy some time outdoors. I mean, you're
I did.
outside now.
Yeah, unfortunately, due to puppy circumstances, I was not in front of my computer this time. So next week I will be. So
All
make
good.
life easier. But yeah,
and we like I said, guys, we try our best to record and have everything up on Wednesdays and Fridays. This week, kind of life got away from me. It was my fault. So here we are on Saturday. This will be up today, and we'll see you guys next week.
see you guys.
Awesome.
Take
Good
care.
talking,
Thanks,
Talk
guys.
to you later, brothers.
Later.
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 Bye.
Bye.
All right, so that was the Hacker Outdoors podcast with Brian Hacker and Joey McCormick. If you like what you heard, please give us a rating on whatever platform you are listening to or watching this on. Please check the show notes for some links about the topics we discussed today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.